Okay, now we're going to have a look at the Canon 40D. The 40D is typical of larger Canon bodies that have two control dials. So it's a similar camera layout to the Nikon D90 that we saw earlier. So here are two dials, there's one up here and one on the back. Now with the 40D and similar cameras, again we have quite a lot of buttons actually on the camera body, so we can change the settings easily without having to go into the menu. So the way that Canon has laid their buttons out is quite interesting. As you can see, we've got three main buttons along the top, and each button has two functions. So if you look at the button on the right, it does both ISO and flash compensation. The next one does autofocus and drive, and the last one does the light meter and white balance. The way that this works is you press the button that you want to change. So let's take ISO for example, and you don't have to hold the button down. You just have to half press the shutter button first, press the button, and you can take your finger off it. Now with this button layout, if the word is on the left hand side, so in this case ISO, then if we press the button, the forward command dial always changes the setting on the left. The rear command dial will change the setting on the right, such as flash compensation. So on the next button, the forward dial will change autofocus and the rear dial will change the drive mode. That's always the same on all Canons. So let's have a look at what each one will actually do. Flash compensation we will discuss when we look at flash in the flash section. But ISO is going to change our sensitivity. So again, press the button and now it's the forward dial that's going to change the ISO setting. So we can go all the way down to 100 or go much higher up, depending on the camera that you've got. But typically a 100 or 200 ISO is good. The next button, AF and drive, the forward button is going to change our autofocus mode. So on Canons, they have different terminology than on the Nikons. One shot is for subjects that don't move. So it's very similar to Nikon's AFS mode. So if your subject is not moving, then use the one shot mode. AI focus is an automatic mode which will choose between one shot or AI servo. It starts off in the one shot mode and goes to AI servo, which is Canon's continuous autofocus mode if the subject starts to move. Personally, I would suggest either picking one shot or AI servo. AI servo mode is a continuous autofocus mode. So if your subject is moving, then choose AI servo mode. So the drive button is the same button. We're going to press that. Now we're going to use the rear dial and we can change the frame rate. So I'm just going to go back to the beginning. So the single rectangle is a one shot mode. If I just press the button down, I can only take one picture. Go to the drive button again, move the rear dial. Now we're in high speed continuous mode. You can hear that we've got a lot of shots. And then we have low speed continuous mode. So we get continuous shots but at a lower speed than high speed that we just saw. Now we have the self timer. Self timer at 2 seconds. And back to the single frame mode. So that's the middle button, which changes autofocus and drive. So now let's have a look at changing white balance on this Canon 40D. So we'll half press the shutter button again, wake the camera up, press the white balance button here, and then we'll move the back dial. So we started off on automatic white balance, AWB. Then we have daylight, shady, cloudy or overcast, tungsten, fluorescent, flash. Then we have the ability to record a preset and then finally we can put in a Kelvin value, then back to automatic. So that's changing the white balance. Okay, let's have a look now at how we change the aperture and the shutter speed when we're in different modes. So we're currently in the program mode, and in the program mode and the other modes, to do exposure compensation, we half press the shutter button and then you turn the dial on the back. So as I turn the dial on the back, let's wake the camera up again, then you can see that we've got a change of exposure. Now if you're turning the dial on the back and nothing's happening, what may have happened is that you've put the switch in the middle position. On most of the Canon bodies, you've got on, off, but there's also a middle setting which turns this dial off or locks it. So if you're turning the dial and nothing's changing, then make sure you put the switch fully to the top, then the dial becomes live. So turning the back dial is exposure compensation. And if you don't like the aperture or shutter speed that program has selected, then you can change that by moving the front dial. Now if we go to TV mode, TV is time value, that's the same as shutter priority, then the front dial will again change the shutter speed and the back dial does the exposure compensation. So the back dial always does exposure compensation. In this case you can see that the aperture f4 is flashing. If the lowest aperture of the lens is flashing, that means that there's not enough light to give you the shutter speed, in this case of a 400th of a second. If the smallest aperture of the lens is flashing whilst you're in shutter priority mode, then that means that the scene is too bright for the shutter speed that you've got selected. We'll see that when we go outside. In AV mode, that's aperture priority, you use the front dial this time to choose the aperture that you want, and the back dial again controls the exposure compensation. In manual mode, turning the front dial will change the shutter speed and the back dial will change the aperture. There is no exposure compensation on Canon bodies, you just choose the aperture and the shutter speed. So if you want exposure compensation, just put the light meter where you need it. So that's most of the functionality on this Canon 40D. As I mentioned earlier, this is the same for all Canon bodies with a dial both here at the front and on the back.